In the vast silent archives of history, amidst the treaties signed and the battlefields consecrated, there are stories that lie dormant, waiting for the light. They are not tales of grand strategy or political conquest, but of the human heart, caught in the unforgiving gears of a world gone mad. We look at the faded photographs of royalty, at the palaces of stone and the crowns of jewel, and we imagine a life shielded from the brutalities of the common experience. But history, in its most honest moments, teaches a different, more terrible lesson. It teaches that sometimes a palace is merely a more ornate prison. Sometimes a crown is not a shield, but a bullseye. Today we undertake a deep and unflinching journey into one of the most profound and sorrowfully overlooked royal tragedies of the 20th century. It is the story of a woman whose life was composed in the key of art and love, but whose final symphony was one of fire, pain, and ultimate betrayal. Her name was Princess Mafalda of Savoy. She was the cherished daughter of the King of Italy, a gifted musician, a devoted wife and mother. Her world should have been one of beauty, charity, and peace. Instead, by a cruel twist of fate and a fateful act of love, she found herself chained to the very epicenter of European fascism. Her story is a harrowing odyssey that takes us from the sun-drenched marble halls of Rome's Quirinal Palace to the frozen, blood-soaked earth of Buchenwald, one of humanity's darkest pits of despair. To follow her path is to confront agonizing questions. Where does a daughter's loyalty to her father end? And where does a wife's loyalty to her husband begin, especially when both paths lead to ruin? What becomes of a gentle, compassionate spirit when it is systematically starved of all that is good and beautiful? This is more than the forgotten chronicle of a princess. It is a meticulous examination of human dignity under unimaginable pressure, a testament to the particular horrors reserved for women in wartime, and a solemn reminder that behind the monumental crimes of history, there are always individual heartbeats, individual souls, silenced one by one. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up, let us know your thoughts in the comments section, and subscribe so you won't miss out on future uploads. See you next time. To comprehend the impossible vice in which Mafalda would one day be crushed, we must first inhabit the two worlds that forged her. These were two of Europe's most ancient and pedigreed royal houses, each grappling with the violent dawn of the modern age. The House of Savoy in a still young Italy, and the House of Hesse in a defeated and humiliated Germany. The Italy that welcomed Mafalda into the world on November 19, 1902, was a nation of profound contradictions, a grand theater of old and new. Its cities hummed with the energy of the first automobiles and electric lights, yet its countryside was steeped in traditions that had not changed for centuries. It was a kingdom barely 40 years old, stitched together from a patchwork of fiercely independent duchies, papal states and city-states, each with its own dialect, cuisine, and deep-seated suspicions of its neighbors. This new nation pulsed with the energy of industrialization in the north, while much of the south remained locked in an almost feudal poverty. It was a land of breathtaking art and culture, a living museum to the Renaissance, existing alongside a political system rife with instability, factionalism, and corruption. At the apex of this fragile national structure stood the House of Savoy, a dynasty whose roots stretched back to the Holy Roman Empire, 1,000 years into the mists of European history, now tasked with embodying the unity of a nation that was still learning how to be one. Mafalda's father, King Victor Emmanuel III, was a man curiously at odds with his era, a monarch defined more by his reticence than his pronouncements. In an age of charismatic strongmen and bombastic rhetoric, he was diminutive, standing barely 5 feet 3 inches tall, a physical stature that fed a lifelong complex. He was pathologically shy, a man whose discomfort in public was palpable. His aversion to the spotlight was likely deepened by the trauma of his youth. His own father, King Umberto I, had been assassinated by an anarchist in 1900. This event undoubtedly reinforced Victor Emmanuel's cautious, non-confrontational nature, his preference for careful procedure over bold action. He famously confessed he felt more comfortable with his horses and books than with his own subjects. His great passion was numismatics. He would spend countless hours in his library, meticulously cataloging his coin collection, which remains one of the most important in the world. For him, these small metal discs were a refuge, a world of clear dates, verifiable facts, and tangible history, a stark contrast to the messy, unpredictable world of politics he was forced to navigate. He was a constitutional monarch by temperament and by law, viewing his role as a passive symbol of national unity, a quiet arbiter rather than an active ruler. This profound reluctance to assert his authority, born of both personality and trauma, would have catastrophic consequences when a swaggering, ambitious journalist named Benito Mussolini began his march on power. For now, however, he presided over a court that was formal, traditional, and, on the surface, seemingly secure. If the king was the quiet, reserved head of the family, its soul and conscience was undoubtedly Mafalda's mother, Queen Elena of Montenegro. She was a woman of striking beauty and even more striking character, a true daughter of the Black Mountain. Montenegro was a small, rugged kingdom famed for its fierce warriors and poets, and Elena brought that spirit of resilience and deep-seated integrity to the Italian court. She was tall and statuesque, dwarfing her husband, and this visual contrast only highlighted their complementary partnership. She possessed a deep, unwavering empathy that the Italian people adored, seeing in her a maternal warmth that the stiff court often lacked. Her charity was not merely symbolic, it was practical and hands-on. When a devastating earthquake struck Messina in 1908, she was among the first on the scene, organizing relief efforts and personally tending to the wounded. To better serve during the Great War, she studied medicine, becoming a qualified nurse and converting a wing of the magnificent Quirinal Palace into a state-of-the-art hospital where she worked tirelessly. She was a woman of deep faith and boundless charity, and she was determined to raise her children, Yolanda, Mafalda, the heir Umberto, Giovanna, and Maria Francesca, to be more than just royal figureheads. She cultivated in them a love for music, literature, and art, and a powerful sense of compassion for the less fortunate, ensuring their lives had purpose beyond protocol. Mafalda was the true inheritor of her mother's artistic spirit. Known affectionately within the family as Muti, she was endowed with a sunny, cheerful disposition and a genuine, sensitive gift for music and drawing. Her childhood, though governed by the strict protocols of royalty, was filled with a palpable warmth that Queen Elena carefully nurtured. It unfolded between the vast historic corridors of the Quirinal in Rome, where formality reigned, and the pastoral freedom of their summer estates, particularly the Castello di Racconigi. There, amidst parks and farmland, the royal children could live a more relaxed life, riding bicycles and spending time outdoors, temporarily shedding the burdens of their titles. Mafalda developed a particularly close bond with her brother Umberto, the sensitive and handsome crown prince who shared her love of the arts, and her younger sister Giovanna, who, like Mafalda, would one day marry into a foreign, politically fraught monarchy. Educated by the finest private tutors, she became fluent in several languages. But her true passions lay at the piano, where she would lose herself for hours, and with her sketchbooks, which were filled with delicate drawings of flowers and portraits of her family. Her talent was considered more than a mere hobby. It was a genuine expression of a gentle, observant, and deeply romantic soul. Her world was one of beauty, order, and deep familial love, a world tragically ill-equipped to prepare her for the moral chaos that lay ahead. Meanwhile, across the Alps, another ancient dynasty was reeling from the verdict of history. The House of Hesse-Kassel had been a major force in Germany for centuries. A family of electors and landgraves, Prince Philip of Hesse, Mafalda's future husband, was born at the very zenith of this world, into a web of kinship that defined European power. His lineage was impeccable. His father was the head of the House of Hesse. His mother, Princess Margaret of Prussia, was the youngest sister of the last German emperor, Kaiser Wilhelm II. This connection also made Philip a direct great-grandson of Queen Victoria of the United Kingdom, through her eldest daughter Vicky, the German Empress Frederick. This Anglo-German heritage was a core part of the family's identity, a legacy of being caught between two worlds, a fact that would gain a terrible irony in the years to come. Philippe was woven into the very fabric of European royalty, a cousin to the rulers of Britain, Germany, and Russia. This dual heritage was more than just a line on a family tree. It was a source of cultural and political tension that had shaped his family for a generation. His grandmother, Empress Frederick, known as Vicky, was Queen Victoria's brilliant and favorite child. She had arrived in Germany as a young bride, hoping to mold her new homeland into a liberal constitutional monarchy like her native Britain. She championed democracy and parliamentary rule, clashing famously with the iron-willed Chancellor Otto von Bismarck and the deeply conservative, militaristic Prussian court. She was never fully accepted, often viewed with suspicion as the English woman. The home she built after her husband's early death, Schloss Kronberg, was a magnificent English-style manor, a piece of Surrey set down in the German countryside, a testament to her enduring identity. Philippe and his brothers grew up in this environment, fluent in English, spending holidays with their British royal cousins, yet destined for a life of service to the German Empire. They were raised with a certain liberal, cosmopolitan sensibility that set them apart from the more rigid and provincial Prussian Junkers. The world that Philip was raised to inhabit, a world where he might have navigated these two identities on the grand stage of European diplomacy, was shattered in the autumn of 1918. The German Empire was defeated, the Kaiser abdicated and fled into exile, and the family's imperial status vanished overnight. For the German aristocracy, this was a cataclysm, a profound loss of identity, purpose, and prestige. It was not just the loss of power, it was the loss of a worldview. Their place in society, which they believed was ordained by God and tradition, was gone. The military careers that were the birthright of young men like Philip were now closed off. The very army they were meant to lead disgraced and dismantled. They were left with their titles, their castles, and their immense wealth, but they were now mere citizens of the tumultuous, and in their eyes, despised Weimar Republic. This new democratic Germany was everything they were not. They saw it as chaotic, decadent, and weak, a government of socialists and liberals born from the shame of defeat and imposed upon them by their enemies. In the vibrant experimental culture of Weimar Berlin, they saw only moral decay. For a young prince like Philip, raised for a life of structure, duty, and command, The future was a void. It is no surprise, then, that he sought refuge in the past. He pursued his studies in art history and architecture with a passion that was more than academic. It was a search for meaning in a meaningless world. He found solace in the beauty and order of the past. The art of the Italian Renaissance and Baroque, with its heroic figures, its celebration of power and faith, and its clear, divinely ordained hierarchies, offered a powerful antidote to the fractured, uncertain reality of his own time. It was this quest that led him to spend long periods in Italy, immersing himself in the galleries of Florence and the architectural splendors of Rome. And it was during these sojourns in the vibrant, artistic, and aristocratic circles of Rome in the early 1920s that he met and was captivated by the charming and spirited Italian princess, Mafalda of Savoy. In a city that was itself a living masterpiece, recovering from one great war while already feeling the first political tremors of Mussolini's rising fascist movement, these two young royals found in each other a shared sensibility. In their mutual love for art, music, and a world of grace and beauty, they carved out a personal idyll, a beautiful cultured escape from the harsh political realities brewing in both their homelands. The seduction of National Socialism, for a man like Prince Philip of Hesse, is one of the more troubling questions of the era, a dark puzzle of class anxiety and personal ambition. It was not the simple, brutish appeal it held for the uneducated masses who cheered at torchlit rallies. For a significant portion of the German aristocracy, men who saw themselves as the rightful guardians of the nation's soul, the Nazi Party was seen as a distasteful but necessary medicine. Their waking nightmare was the specter of Bolshevism, which had not just deposed but brutally annihilated their royal cousins in Russia, a fate they were determined to avoid at all costs. In their eyes, the Weimar Republic, with its chaotic democracy, vibrant and decadent modern art, and political weakness, was merely a halfway house to a communist takeover. Hitler, with his fanatical anti-communism and his hypnotic promises to restore national pride, tear up the Treaty of Versailles, and rebuild Germany's military might, seemed to many a useful, if vulgar, tool. They believed with a fatal arrogance that they could control him. They thought they could use his popular movement as a battering ram to crush the left, and then, with order restored, discard him and guide Germany back to a more palatable authoritarian state, perhaps even a restored monarchy. It was a miscalculation of historic, and for Mafalda, deeply personal proportions. Philip officially joined the Nazi Party in 1930, a move that placed him ahead of many of his peers and signaled a serious commitment. His own brother, Christoph, had already become a fervent member of the SS, embedding the ideology deep within their family circle. Philip's motives were a complex blend of this aristocratic anti-communism, a sincere nationalist feeling that Germany had been wronged, and an undeniable streak of personal opportunism. After years of feeling adrift and powerless, here was a movement that promised a return to greatness and a meaningful role for men like him. His high social standing and, crucially, his marriage to the daughter of the King of Italy made him an invaluable prize for a paranoid Hitler who craved any connection that could lend his radical movement a veneer of traditional legitimacy. Philippe was a bridge to the old establishment at home and a potential channel to a key fascist ally abroad. When Hitler seized absolute power in 1933, Philippe's early allegiance was rewarded handsomely. He was appointed Oberpresident, governor, of the Prussian province of Hesse-Nassau, a position of significant authority that placed the entire civil administration of the region under his command. For Mafalda, this was a horrifying development. She was no longer just the wife of a party member, but the first lady of a Nazi-governed state, expected to smile and preside over functions that represented everything she loathed. But his most important role, the one that entangled him completely, was far more personal and clandestine. He became a key figure in Hitler's inner circle, not as a political ideologue. He lacked the fanatical zeal, but as a facilitator and a man of taste. He advised Hitler, and more significantly, the bombastic Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring, on the acquisition of art. Göring's greed was legendary and vulgar, a stark contrast to Philippe's own cultured sensibilities. Yet Philippe became a key facilitator for his vast, rapacious collection, a collection built on both legally purchased works and, as the Reich expanded, art looted from across Europe. Each painting he helped procure was a betrayal of the very principles of beauty and culture he and Mafalda had once shared, turning their mutual passion into a source of immense marital pain for her. His fluency in Italian and his personal access to the Quirinal Palace through his wife made him the perfect secret envoy between Hitler and Mussolini. He would travel to Rome under the pretext of a family visit with Mafalda and the children, carrying confidential messages and verbal agreements between the two dictators, his diplomatic missions carefully hidden from the official foreign ministries of both countries. He became a regular at the Berghof, Hitler's alpine sanctuary, and a familiar face at the lavish, decadent receptions of the new Nazi elite. For Mafalda, this was a descent into a moral abyss. The cultured, art-loving man she had married was now a willing functionary of a regime that celebrated thuggery and racial hatred. The beautiful Schloss Kronberg was now the home of a high-ranking Nazi official. While she continued to perform her public duties with grace, her private life became an act of quiet, sustained resistance. She utterly despised Hitler and his cronies. She found them vulgar, ill-mannered, and terrifying. She made no secret of her disgust to her close friends and family. Anecdotes from this period paint a clear picture of her dissent. She steadfastly refused to allow the swastika flag to be flown at Kronberg unless it was absolutely required by protocol for an official visit. On one occasion, when Hitler gifted her a signed copy of Mein Kampf, she reportedly used it as a doorstop. She made pointedly sarcastic remarks about the Nazi leadership that were noted by nervous guests. Most significantly, she intensified her escapes to Rome. These were no longer simple family visits. They were desperate flights for moral and psychological survival, a chance to immerse herself in the familiar world of her youth, far from the suffocating atmosphere of fear and fanaticism that now pervaded her German home. This created an almost unbearable tension within her marriage. Philip was often torn between his duty to the regime and his affection for his wife. But as the 1930s wore on, the Nazi state became total. There was no room for private dissent. Mafalda's overt Italianness and her barely concealed contempt for the Führer made her a person of intense suspicion to the Nazi security apparatus. Heinrich Himmler's Gestapo kept a file on her. Joseph Goebbels in his diaries seethed with hatred for her, convinced she was an Italian spy. His descriptions of her are venomous, calling her a scheming bitch and the craftiest carrion in the Italian court. Hitler, while still finding her husband useful, shared this deep-seated distrust. He saw her not as an individual, but as an extension of her father, the treacherous Italian king whom he believed was an unreliable ally. His infamous remark, calling her the blackest carrion in the Italian royal house, was more than a vile insult. It was a sentence. It marked her as an enemy within, a foreign element to be watched and, if necessary, eliminated. The birth of their youngest children, Otto in 1937 and Elizabeth in 1940, brought moments of private joy, but they occurred against a backdrop of escalating horror. The Anschluss with Austria, the annexation of Czechoslovakia, the Kristallnacht pogrom. Each event pulled her world deeper into darkness. With the invasion of Poland in 1939 and the beginning of the Second World War, Mafalda's tightrope finally snapped. She was now the daughter of a neutral king, living in the heart of an aggressor nation. When Mussolini, against her father's better judgment, dragged Italy into the war on Germany's side in June 1940, her fate was sealed. She was now trapped, a citizen of two allied dictatorships, loved by one family and despised by the leadership of the other, a fragile, beautiful bird in a cage built by monsters. The early years of the war were a period of intense anxiety for Mafalda. Her husband Philippe was often away, engaged in his duties for the regime. Her two eldest sons, Moritz and Heinrich, were approaching an age where they would be expected to serve in the German military. She was largely confined to Kronberg, raising her 4 children in a country whose victory she could not desire. Her correspondence and her trips to Rome became more scrutinized, her every move monitored. She was living in a state of suspended animation, praying for an end to the conflict that was tearing her allegiances and her soul apart. The year 1943 was the year the dam broke. The Axis war effort was collapsing. The German Sixth Army had been annihilated at Stalingrad. In May, the Axis forces in North Africa surrendered. The Allied war machine was now poised to strike at what Winston Churchill called the soft underbelly of Europe, Italy. On the night of July 9th to 10th, Allied forces launched Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily. The Italian divisions on the island, poorly led and equipped, offered little resistance. The swift fall of Sicily sent a shockwave through the Italian establishment. It was clear that the war was lost and that continuing the fight alongside Germany would lead to the complete destruction of Italy. A plot to overthrow Mussolini, which had been simmering for months, now boiled over. The coup was executed on July 24th to 25th. The fascist Grand Council, in a stunning move, voted no confidence in its leader. The next day, King Victor Emmanuel III, summoning a courage that had lain dormant for 20 years, summoned Mussolini to the Villa Savoia. In a brief, tense meeting, the king calmly informed the dictator that he was being replaced. As a bewildered Mussolini exited the villa, he was arrested by Carabinieri. The king appointed Marshal Pietro Badoglio, a respected but conservative military figure, as prime minister. The news of Mussolini's fall was met with widespread jubilation across Italy. Statues of the Duce were torn down, and people celebrated in the streets, believing the war was over. But it was not. In his Wolf's Lair headquarters in East Prussia, Hitler reacted to the news with volcanic fury. He screamed of betrayal, convinced the king had been plotting against him all along. He had always despised the Italian monarchy for its perceived weakness and its lingering pro-British sentiments. This confirmed all his prejudices. He immediately gave the order to implement Operation Axe, a meticulously prepared plan to invade and occupy Italy, neutralize its army, and hunt down the traitors. At this exact perilous moment, Mafalda was preparing for a journey born of family tragedy. In late August, she received devastating news from her sister Tsarina Giovanna in Sofia. Giovanna's husband, Tsar Boris III of Bulgaria, was dead. Boris had just returned from a brutal meeting with Hitler, where he had steadfastly refused to deport Bulgaria's Jewish population or commit his troops to the war against the Soviet Union. He returned to Sofia, and a few days later the healthy 49-year-old monarch died of a sudden mysterious heart attack. Giovanna was convinced he had been administered a slow-acting poison on Hitler's orders. Mafalda, heartbroken for her sister, made immediate plans to travel to Sofia for the funeral. It was a decision that would seal her fate. While she was in Bulgaria, comforting her grieving sister, the Badoglio government was secretly finalizing its surrender to the Allies. On September 8, 1943, as Mafalda prepared to return home, the Allies broadcast the news of the armistice. For Hitler, this was the final, unforgivable act of treachery. He unleashed his legions. German troops poured across the Alps. The Italian royal family had to flee. In the pre-dawn hours of September 9th, as German paratroopers descended on Rome, King Victor Emmanuel, Queen Elena, and Crown Prince Umberto escaped the capital and in a motorcade. Their flight to the safety of Allied-controlled Brindisi in the south, while saving the monarchy as a legal entity, was seen by many Italians as a final act of abandonment, leaving Rome and its people to the mercy of the vengeful Germans. Mafalda heard the news in Sofia and was thrown into a state of panic. She was now in enemy territory, the daughter of the man Hitler considered the world's greatest traitor. Her children were in Rome, a city now under German occupation. The German officials in Sofia urged her to fly directly to Germany, into the protection of her husband's family. But her maternal instincts screamed louder than any political logic. She had to get back to her children. Her journey was a nightmare of deception and dread. She boarded a German plane, believing it would take her to Rome. Instead, it was diverted multiple times. She was flown around the Balkans before finally landing at Pescara, only to find that her parents had already passed through on their flight to safety. Alone, terrified but resolute, she finally managed to secure passage on another flight to Rome. She landed in a city transformed. The streets were patrolled by German soldiers, the atmosphere thick with fear. She raced to the Vatican, where her 4 children had been given sanctuary under the protection of Pope Pius XII. The reunion was a moment of pure, agonizing relief, a mother embracing her children in the eye of a hurricane. For a few days, within the neutral territory of the Vatican City, she was safe, but she could not stay hidden forever. On September 22nd, a message was delivered. It was from the German High Command. They informed her that they had arranged an urgent telephone call for her from her husband, Philippe. It was a lie of diabolical cruelty. Philippe himself had already been arrested on Hitler's orders, branded a traitor because of his ties to the Italian royals, and was on his way to the Flossenburg concentration camp. Mafalda, knowing nothing of this, clung to the hope of hearing her husband's voice. It was a lure she could not resist. Against the frantic advice of Vatican officials, she agreed to go. She was driven to the German headquarters on the Via Tasso, a building that would soon become infamous as a center of Gestapo torture. The moment she stepped inside, the trap was sprung. She was met not with a telephone, but with the cold eyes of SS Colonel Herbert Kappler, the chief of German security in Rome. He informed her she was under arrest. Her pleas, her royal status meant nothing. She was Hitler's personal prisoner, a symbol of Italian betrayal to be disposed of as he saw fit. She was put on a plane, flown first to Munich, then to Berlin for interrogation. From there, she was loaded onto a sealed train, her destination one of the most feared names in the geography of Nazi terror, Buchenwald. The arrival at Buchenwald was a descent into a circle of hell Dante could not have imagined. Carved into a hill of beech trees, Buchenwald, overlooking the city of Weimar, the cradle of German Enlightenment, the camp was a sprawling universe of systematized cruelty. Its infamous gate bore the cynical motto, Jedem das Sein, to each his own, or more accurately, to each what he deserves. It was a place where tens of thousands were worked to death in quarries and armaments factories, starved on watery soup, and subjected to grotesque medical experiments and routine torture by sadistic SS guards under the command of men like Karl Otto Koch. Mafalda was not thrown into the teeming, typhus-ridden squalor of the main camp. As a prisoner of unique political importance, a Sonderhäftling, she was taken to a special compound, the Isolier Baracke. This was a small, heavily guarded wooden barrack enclosed by its own barbed wire fence, situated with lethal proximity to the Gustloff Werk II munitions factory. It was a prison within a prison, designed to hold the Nazis' most high-profile captives in complete secrecy. Her fellow inmates were a ghostly collection of Europe's fallen elite: Léon Blum, the former Jewish Prime Minister of France, and his wife, other French politicians, high-ranking military officers, and dissident German clergy. Here, her royal identity was officially obliterated. She was registered under the name Frau von Weber, a meaningless pseudonym designed to render her anonymous. But while the Nazis could strip her of her name, they could not touch the core of her being. In the midst of this living nightmare, Mafalda's innate dignity and compassion became a source of quiet inspiration. Survivor testimonies paint a consistent portrait of a woman who refused to be broken. Dr. Eugen Kogon, a political prisoner whose seminal work, The Theory and Practice of Hell, became a classic text on the concentration camp system, personally witnessed her fortitude. He noted her quiet grace and her refusal to complain. The German pastor Paul Schneider, another inmate of the special compound before his own murder, described her as a woman of deep faith and serenity. The most powerful accounts speak of her charity. The few food parcels she was allowed to receive were never for herself. She immediately and discreetly shared their contents, a piece of chocolate, a biscuit, a small tin of sardines, with those who were weaker or had nothing at all. She became a silent, comforting presence, an angel, as one survivor later called her, who retained her humanity in a place designed to destroy it. She was utterly alone with her thoughts, with no news of her children's fate, no knowledge of her husband's whereabouts, aware only that her father's actions had led her to this pit. The constant noise of the factory, the smell of coal smoke mixed with the sickeningly sweet scent from the crematorium chimneys, the sight of emaciated prisoners being marched to their deaths. This was the fabric of her existence. She, who had been raised on Bach and Mozart, was now subjected to the relentless soundtrack of industrial-scale murder. She survived the brutal German winter of 1943-44, her health slowly deteriorating from the starvation diet and the intense psychological stress. For almost a year she endured, and then, on August 24th, 1944, the war that had imprisoned her came to claim her. Allied intelligence had identified the Gustloff Werk II factory as a key target. On that clear August day, a squadron of American B-17 bombers appeared in the sky over Buchenwald. Their target was the factory, not the prisoners' barracks. But in the terrifying imprecision of aerial bombardment, the distinction was meaningless. The Isolier Baracke, standing right next to the factory, was directly in the path of destruction. The bombs rained down. The world dissolved into a deafening roar of explosions, fire, and flying shrapnel. The wooden barrack was blown apart. When the smoke and dust began to settle, a frantic search began in the rubble. They found Mafalda buried up to her neck in debris. She was alive, but horrifically wounded. The blast had nearly severed her left arm at the shoulder, and the intense heat from the exploding bombs had inflicted deep, third-degree burns across her back and neck. Fellow prisoners, including Léon Blum, rushed to free her. It took them hours to carefully dig her out of the wreckage. She was conscious, her body racked with unimaginable pain. But her first thoughts were not for herself. To those who rescued her, she whispered her now famous last words, a final testament to her character. "I'm dying. Remember me not as a princess, but as your Italian sister, Mafalda." She was carried to the camp infirmary, which, in a final grotesque twist of fate, was located in the building that had once served as the camp's SS brothel. The medical facilities were a horrifying parody of a hospital. The doctors were prisoners themselves, valiant men working with almost no medicine, no clean bandages, and no anesthesia. Mafalda's wounds were mortal without proper surgical care. Gangrene, the terrifying specter of battlefield medicine, quickly set in on her burned and shattered arm. For 4 days she lay in agony, drifting in and out of consciousness. The SS camp doctors observed her condition with cold detachment. Finally, on the night of August 27th, they gave the order to operate. The camp surgeon, a prisoner named Dr. Szydlowski, was tasked with amputating what was left of her arm. The circumstances of this surgery are the final dark controversy of her life. Was it a genuine, if hopeless, attempt to save her? Or was it, as many survivors believed, a deliberately slow and clumsy procedure designed to ensure she would not survive medical murder under the convenient cover of a surgical emergency? The truth is impossible to know with certainty, but the outcome was tragically clear. In her profoundly weakened and malnourished state, with no possibility of a blood transfusion, the shock of the amputation was too severe. She began to hemorrhage uncontrollably. The prisoner doctors could only watch in horror as she bled to death. Sometime in the dark, early hours of August 28, 1944, Princess Mafalda of Savoy died on a soiled cot in a former brothel, another victim among the millions consumed by the Nazi Inferno. Her body was taken to be incinerated, to be erased from existence. But a final small act of courage granted her a different fate. A priest from Padua, Father Joseph Thiel, who was a prisoner assigned to the crematorium, recognized her. Risking immediate execution if discovered, he secretly arranged for her body to be placed in a separate, crude coffin and buried in an unmarked grave outside the crematorium wall, with only a number for identification. It was his personal act of witness, a refusal to let her be turned into anonymous ash, a belief that one day the world would want to know what had happened to the Italian king's daughter. The end of the war in 1945 brought an end to the Nazi regime, but for the survivors of Mafalda's family, it was the beginning of a lifetime of reckoning with her loss. Her 4 children, Moritz, Heinrich, Otto, and Elizabeth, miraculously survived. Their final year of the war was one of terrifying uncertainty. After their time in the Vatican, they had been taken by the SS and were effectively held as high-value hostages, moved from place to place in Bavaria as the Allied fronts closed in. Their survival was by no means guaranteed, and their liberation was a final fortunate turn of the wheel in a story defined by tragedy. They were eventually reunited with their father, Philippe, after his own liberation from a series of concentration camps and his subsequent denazification trial by the Allies. While the tribunals ultimately acquitted him of major war crimes, finding he had no direct hand in the regime's worst atrocities, he was classified as a lesser offender for his collaboration. The verdict was a legal nuance that could never scrub away the moral stain. He returned to a shattered Germany and to 4 children who would grow up without their mother. Philippe, the once dashing prince and art connoisseur, would live out the rest of his long life. He died in 1980 as a man haunted by the ghosts of his own choices. Schloss Kronberg, once the scene of their idyllic early marriage, became a magnificent monument to his grief, its silent corridors filled with the memory of the wife his political ambitions had led to slaughter. He had played with fire, and while he himself had survived the burns, his entire world had been reduced to ash. The House of Savoy, the ancient dynasty for which Mafalda was a pawn and a victim, crumbled into dust with an almost poetic finality. King Victor Emmanuel III, hopelessly tainted by his 2 decades of enabling fascism and his flight from Rome, was a pariah in the new anti-fascist Italy. The monarchy he had sought to preserve through his desperate pact with the Allies was now indefensible. In a last-minute attempt to save the throne, he abdicated in May 1946 in favor of his son. Mafalda's beloved brother became King Umberto II. His reign, however, lasted only 34 days, earning him the poignant nickname, the May King. On June 2, 1946, the Italian people, scarred by war and humiliation, were asked to choose their future. In a bitter and closely fought referendum that exposed the deep divisions in the country, they voted decisively, by a margin of 54% to 46%, to abolish the monarchy and establish a republic. The 1,000-year reign of the House of Savoy was over. Umberto went into a lifelong exile from which he would never return. Mafalda's parents, the deposed King Victor Emmanuel and Queen Elena, lived out their final years in the humid seaside climate of Alexandria, Egypt. From the grandeur of the Quirinal Palace to a villa in a foreign land, they were left with nothing but their memories, chief among them the agonizing grief for a lost daughter whose fate was so tragically intertwined with that of their lost kingdom. The historical significance of Princess Mafalda, however, has grown far beyond the confines of her family's tragedy. In Italy, she is revered as a national martyr. She became a unifying symbol for a nation struggling with its own complex guilt. Mafalda was untainted by fascism. She was royalty, who had suffered and died like the common people in the camps, and her death at the hands of the Germans offered a clear narrative of Italian victimhood. She has been memorialized in books, documentaries, and even on an Italian postage stamp. She represents a different Italy, not the Italy of black-shirted fascists, but the Italy of the sommersi e I salvati, the drowned and the saved, the Italy that was also a victim of totalitarianism. Globally, her story serves as a powerful and enduring cautionary tale. It shatters the romantic illusion of royalty as a shield against the world's evils. It is a stark reminder that in times of ideological fanaticism, no one is safe. Her life and death also cast a harsh light on the particular vulnerabilities of women in wartime, where they are so often targeted not for their own actions, but as symbolic proxies for the men in their lives. Mafalda was not a soldier, a spy, or a resistance leader. She was arrested, imprisoned, and ultimately killed because she was her father's daughter. Her story is a chilling example of how, in the calculus of tyrants, identity itself can become a capital crime. After the liberation of Buchenwald, Father Thiel's brave act of witness came to light. He led investigators to the secret, unmarked grave. Mafalda's remains were exhumed and formally identified, a moment of profound sorrow and validation. A few years later, her body was transported from the cursed ground of Thuringia to the quiet, ancestral lands of her husband's family. In a final, somber journey, she was brought home to Germany and given a final, dignified resting place. She was interred in the crypt of the House of Hesse at Kronberg Castle. The journey from an anonymous pit near a crematorium to a stately tomb in the grounds of the home where she had spent her happiest years as a young wife and mother is a pilgrimage from horror to peace, from anonymity to eternal remembrance. There she lies today, an Italian princess in German soil, a silent, heartbreaking testament to a shared and savage history. To trace the life of Princess Mafalda of Savoy is to witness a collision of beauty and brutality, of love and hatred, of quiet, personal dignity, and loud, public ideology. Her story begins in the ordered, sunlit world of European royalty and ends in the chaotic, lightless pit of a concentration camp. Her story resists easy categorization. She was no political strategist or resistance fighter, but a hero of a quieter, more profound, and perhaps more difficult kind. It was the heroism of a soul that refused to be coarsened by the vulgarity surrounding it. It was the heroism of a heart that continued to practice charity in a system built on theft and starvation. It was the heroism of a spirit that maintained its grace while being subjected to the most profound degradation. In the end, the Nazis could capture her body, erase her name, and extinguish her life, but they could not touch the essence of who she was. Her life asks of us a difficult reckoning. It forces us to examine the nature of complicity, the price of loyalty, and the devastating human cost of political extremism. It reminds us that the great tectonic shifts of history are felt most acutely in the breaking of individual lives. Mafalda was one of those lives, a woman who wanted only to be a wife, a mother, and an artist, but who was cast by fate into a role she never sought, in a drama that had no happy ending. Her final wish at Buchenwald, to be remembered not as a princess but as a sister, is perhaps her most fitting epitaph. It was a plea to be seen beyond the title, beyond the politics, beyond the tragedy. It was a plea to be remembered for her shared humanity. And in honoring that wish, we find the true, enduring legacy of Princess Mafalda of Savoy, a quiet but eternal testament to the fact that even in the deepest darkness, the simple human virtues of compassion and dignity can shine with a light that no amount of hatred can ever fully extinguish.